5 billion CFA francs. That's what it to fund silence, secrecy, and sabotage. To silence a man who had become more than a soldier, a man who had become a symbol. But what happens when that symbol refuses to break? When the truth begins to crawl out from the cracks? This story isn't set in Europe or Washington. It starts right here in Africa, and it's not fiction. Burkina Faso was never just another name on the map. It was a battleground, one where dignity, loyalty, and betrayal clashed in the shadows. Captain Ibrahim, a man both loved and feared, stood at the center of it all. He didn't ask for war, he inherited one. But what he didn't know was that the real war wouldn't come from the outside, it would come from the hand next door. They called it diplomacy, cooperation, brotherhood. But in reality, there was a knife behind the handshake, and that knife was sharpened in the Ivory Coast. In April, as most citizens went about their days, a plot was already being unraveled, one deep enough to ignite the region. Not just politics, but espionage. Not just enemies in the dark, but neighbors in broad daylight. Traitors moved with calm precision, backed by money that could build cities, but was used instead to tear a nation apart. And the most disturbing part? It wasn't the West this time. No, it was Africans conspiring against their own. This is where history repeats with a painful twist. Burkina Faso's intelligence unit didn't sit idle. With old instincts and new technology, they uncovered something chilling. A secret base not in their own backyard, but across the border, nestled in Ouattara Bay, a neighborhood in Abidjan with a past soaked in conflict. Once a base for war, now a hub for betrayal. This wasn't just about politics, it was personal. Because the president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, wasn't just any leader. He was of Burkina Faso origin. His roots, his blood, connected him to the very soil he now stood accused of trying to fracture. His own father's house still stands in Burkina Faso, and yet here we are. The discovery of that compound lit a fire that couldn't be hidden. Plans, messages, names, everything laid bare. And one name stood out among the rest, Bassi Matu. Not a ghost in the shadows, but a man with a face, a history, and a motive. A Burkinabe by birth, a traitor by choice. Why would a man betray his homeland? Why sell loyalty for currency? Perhaps for power, perhaps for promises whispered by foreign lips, or maybe because, for some, a leader like Ibrahim is too dangerous, not because of what he destroys, but because of what he builds. Dignity, independence, courage. This wasn't just about one man, it was a war to crush a rising idea, an idea that Africa could choose its own path, free of Western strings and local puppets. And so they funded a revolution, not of the people, but against them. But something happened, something unexpected. Loyalty. The very thing they thought they could buy, they couldn't. Because while gold may be heavy, honor weighs more. Burkina Faso didn't fall, because soldiers didn't sell out, because mothers and widows didn't forget, because young men stood up and said, no more. And now the question hangs in the air. How far will these forces go to make sure the truth dies quietly? But for every truth uncovered, a deeper lie waited just beneath it. The deeper the investigators dug, the more disturbing the puzzle became. The compound in Ouattara Bay wasn't just an abandoned relic. It had been refitted, reactivated, and heavily guarded. The same base once soaked in the blood of civil war was now breathing with new life. This time, not for national defense, but to orchestrate the fall of a neighboring state. Documents retrieved from within the operation site confirmed their worst fears. Training manuals, encrypted phones, forged eyes, maps of strategic locations within Burkina Faso. This wasn't speculation. This was structured sabotage. And Bassi Matu wasn't acting alone. He was named as a coordinator of operations, but his position was more sinister than just organizer. According to internal communications, he had become the center point, the axis of a growing network that connected foreign contractors, rogue military officers, and political funders operating from outside the continent. Among the files was a record of funds transferred, 24 billion CFA francs. Not a rumor, not a guess, a verified, documented sum. The source, government channels tied directly to the Ivorian presidency. The goal? Destabilization by any means. These weren't soldiers fighting for belief. They were mercenaries contracted for chaos. Many weren't even African. Ex-soldiers from foreign militaries, some with prior deployment experience in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, had returned, not wearing flags, but carrying contracts. Their price? Loyalty to whoever paid them most. And the payment came with a mission: to infiltrate, observe, and when the time was right, dismantle the Burkinabe defense structure from the inside. One document detailed plans to exploit vulnerabilities in local command hierarchies. Another to quietly manipulate members of the civilian defense volunteers, men and women who had picked up arms not as soldiers, but as protectors of their homes. Yet, despite the depth of the plan, there was a flaw. Loyalty. Again and again, that unshakable force turned the tide. Individuals tasked with betrayal, some with full knowledge of the reward, refused. They alerted superiors. They blocked communications. They dismantled logistics before they could activate. No reward could override the weight of knowing what was at stake. A nation fighting not for glory, but for survival. Matu, now desperate, accelerated the operation. His final step was to shift the focus from internal manipulation to direct force. That's when the fighters came. Foreign operatives flown in under forged identities, lodged in safe houses monitored by Burkina Faso's own internal surveillance. One such group was found in the Azalai Hotel, their presence exposed just days before the planned execution of a targeted assault. But exposure didn't stop the mission, because behind every arrested mercenary stood another waiting to replace them. And above them, high in the government halls, the architects of the plot remained untouched. They issued new commands, adjusted timelines, transferred more funds. The machine kept moving. What they didn't calculate was the weight of memory, the long history of interference, the legacy of resistance, because the people had seen this before. In stories told by grandfathers and mothers, in histories written in exile and inked in blood, colonies became states, but the tactics never changed. Arm the few, silence the loud, reward the loyal, and punish the brave. But this time the script was failing, not because the plan wasn't cunning, but because it was familiar. Burkina Faso had seen this dance. The masks were old, the lines tired. And perhaps that's why the resistance didn't flinch, because it wasn't just a coup attempt, it was a reminder that independence is never granted. It is seized, defended, and kept alive by those willing to lose everything for it. Captain Ibrahim's strength was not in his armor or his orders, or even in his reputation. It was in his connection to those who refused to sell their land for silver. His image, though defamed by whispers and headlines, remained unbroken where it mattered most, in the minds of his people. And now the question wasn't will he survive, but rather how far will they go to ensure he doesn't. The truth was out, but exposure alone wasn't enough to halt a war built in silence. As the plot unraveled, Burkina Faso's intelligence teams traced the money trail further. What they uncovered painted a picture of corruption so deeply entrenched, it threatened to fracture not just a country, but a continent's very vision of sovereignty. Bassi Matu, the man who once swore allegiance to his homeland, had become the nerve center of something much larger than a local conspiracy. He wasn't simply betraying a president, he was coordinating a full-scale, multinational operation. His communications linked him directly to agents within Ivory Coast's Interior Ministry, as well as former French military operatives now repackaged as consultants. It was revealed that dozens of former foreign soldiers had returned, not under the banner of any official army, but as private military contractors. These men had previously patrolled the Sahel in uniform under foreign flags. They knew the geography, they knew the weak spots, and worst of all, they knew the people. The plan wasn't just about brute force, it was psychological, cultural. It included strategies for propaganda, flooding social media, targeting journalists, releasing altered footage. They didn't need bullets to kill Ibrahim's credibility. They needed headlines. Fake reports began surfacing. Accusations of abuses, claims of corruption, exaggerated casualties. These weren't coming from the Western outlets anymore. They were published by African media platforms, outlets funded by entities tied to the same war chest built to finance the coup. The tactic was cruelly effective. When lies come from within, they cut deeper. They sound more believable. Suddenly, segments of the population began to waver. Doubts, once buried under trust, began to rise. Was Captain Ibrahim really the man they believed him to be? The architects of this disinformation war understood something devastating. That truth, once questioned, becomes fragile. But again, the plan met resistance. Communities, especially in rural regions, stood firm. They had seen the difference in their own lives. They remembered the silence of previous regimes, the neglect, the abandonment. Under Ibrahim, they had seen roads repaired, schools rebuilt, families of fallen soldiers cared for. These weren't promises. They were visible, tangible changes, and that memory became their defense. Still, Bassi Matu wasn't finished. His next step would stretch the conspiracy beyond the region. Reports began surfacing of secret meetings between his agents and external intelligence contractors operating from Europe and Asia. These weren't random alliances. They were strategic moves designed to secure military-grade weapons and advanced surveillance tools. And they succeeded. Burkina Faso security forces intercepted communications pointing to the delivery of 5 jet fighters, purchased through shell companies registered abroad, their origin traced back to an international arms dealer with known ties to the French Foreign Legion. These aircraft weren't meant for national defense. They were part of the final act, a planned aerial strike on key government buildings in Ouagadougou. It wasn't speculation, it was scheduled. But once again, loyalty tipped the scale. Within hours of the order being issued, 2 junior operatives in Ivory Coast, burdened by conscience, leaked the mission. Their names were never released, their faces never shown. But their message was clear. We are African before we are anything else. And that single decision shifted the tide. The jet operation was dismantled before it left the runway. Arrests were made quietly. Documents, flight plans, even fuel logs were recovered. Not all the perpetrators were captured. Some vanished, but the web had begun to tear. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, the military remained unusually calm. Not because they were unaware, but because they were prepared. Quiet surveillance intensified. Civilian volunteers were trained in new tactics. And Ibrahim, he didn't issue threats. He remained largely silent. Because true leadership doesn't panic in the face of war, it prepares in the shadows, patiently. Yet the question grew louder with every revelation. If one man could orchestrate this much from just across the border, what else was being hidden? And beneath that question lay another colder truth. This wasn't just an operation to remove a president. It was an effort to dismantle belief. Belief that an African country could govern itself. Belief that unity could replace dependency. Belief that dignity could survive betrayal. This was not about Captain Ibrahim alone. It was about the idea he represented. And that was what made him dangerous. The deeper the investigation reached, the more disturbing the pattern became. What began as a coup attempt now looked like something far more deliberate, more coordinated, a continental experiment to test just how fragile a sovereign African state could be if pressed from within by its own. Burkina Faso's security service had managed to seize more than encrypted phones and cache trails. From a series of intercepted audio recordings, they identified an even more dangerous figure, Ibrahim Bizolet. Not a general, not a minister, but a strategist. A man who operated behind sealed doors, whose name was known only to those involved in operations that were never supposed to be made public. He spoke not like a nationalist, but like a man wagering on the collapse of a nation. His recorded words were chilling. Destabilizing Burkina Faso will fracture the AES. That is the only way to reset the region. And to this, Matu replied, "I'm ready. I'll do what must be done." This wasn't politics. It was warfare. And worse, it was personal. Because the AES alliance, born from the shared ambition of sovereign rule among Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, had become a threat to every legacy of foreign dependence. It showed the possibility of rejecting external control, of surviving without the hand of Europe. And that, for many, was an unacceptable future. Biselet's plan wasn't just military, it included an information war of unprecedented scale. Large sums were funneled to private media firms, social media influencers, and even religious figures. The objective was simple: sow doubt, weaken morale, make citizens question everything from food security to faith in their leaders. But they underestimated something old, something ancient: memory. The elders remembered Sankara, they remembered Lumumba, they remembered Gaddafi, not in the way the newspapers told their stories, but in the silence that followed after they were gone. A silence that felt like theft, a silence that erased progress and replaced it with borrowed voices. This time, they weren't ready to forget again. In village meetings and family dinners, the whispers grew louder. They've done this before, and those whispers became shields. Not every lie found a believer. Not every doubt became a fracture. The truth was no longer something handed down from screens. It had returned to firewood conversations and marketplace warnings. But for those driving the plot, time was running out. The 2025 elections in Ivory Coast loomed large, and President Ouattara, already in power for nearly 15 years, was rumored to run again. Though term limits had been blurred, resistance had grown. Streets once quiet now murmured with discontent. Posters were torn, rallies disrupted. The weight of long years began pressing on the public's patience. So the plan shifted again. If Ibrahim could be discredited before the elections, if the AES could be fractured, if instability could be manufactured quickly enough, then Ouattara could rise again, not as a man clinging to power, but as the stabilizing force in a chaotic region. It was a strategy drenched in hypocrisy. Break your neighbor to justify your own control. And Matu remained the tool to make it happen. New intelligence revealed his direct involvement in removing opposition candidates from Ivory Coast's upcoming ballot. A pattern emerged: journalists arrested, civil leaders threatened, opposition organizers detained without explanation. And behind many of those movements, traces of Matu's digital footprint surfaced: deleted texts, location pings, payment requests. He was no longer operating in the shadows. He was operating with confidence, until he made a mistake. Burkina Faso's agents, now well-versed in tracking his methods, intercepted a dispatch. 4 undercover mercenaries were being sent into the country under the guise of logistics consultants. Their mission? Map out key defense zones, identify loyalist commanders, and report vulnerabilities. They never made it out. The arrest took place without a shot, a quiet operation, surgically executed. Their testimonies, however, were thunder. Each detail confirmed what the government had feared. This wasn't an isolated plot. It was a sprawling structure. Offices, hotels, safe houses. It stretched from Abidjan to Bamako, Dakar to Paris. The men confessed to more than movement. They revealed timelines, supply routes, backup plans. And in that moment, the game shifted. Burkina Faso was no longer just defending itself. It now held proof. Proof that betrayal had been funded, orchestrated, and disguised. Proof that the narrative of internal conflict was in fact imported chaos. But even as truth emerged, the greatest challenge remained. How do you rebuild trust in a world where the traitors speak your language, wear your skin, and smile in the mirror? The confessions of the captured mercenaries pulled back the curtain on a theater of deceit that had long operated in silence. They spoke of operations dressed in civilian clothing, of coded language, of unmarked vehicles moving in and out of borders under the cover of night. Some operations had succeeded before. Quiet disruptions, targeted unrest, scattered acts of sabotage mistaken for local dissent. But this one was different. It was larger, bolder, and final. The most disturbing revelation was the delivery of 5 fighter jets, funded by the same 24 billion CFA war chest first uncovered in Ataku Bay. These aircraft were not intercepted in an arms depot or at a base. They were flown into a private airstrip in a neighboring country, far from the international radar, serviced by personnel who had no idea whom they were really working for. Flight logs, repair records, even payment receipts were found. The operation had been recorded with the kind of careless confidence only possessed by men who believe they will never be held accountable. But the web didn't stop at the tarmac. One name kept appearing in communications: Gabriel Bisolay. Unlike Matu, Bisolay never left fingerprints. He used intermediaries, ghost companies, encrypted apps designed to self-erase. Yet patterns emerged: travel between Dubai, Paris, and Abidjan, encrypted financial transfers during periods of regional unrest, offshore accounts moving funds every time an opposition figure was silenced or an African state voiced dissent. This wasn't just about a president or a coup. It was about the control of perception. A multi-pronged attack had been designed: weaken Burkina Faso militarily, fracture it socially, and bury it psychologically. By the time any counter-narrative could rise, it would be too late. The people would be demoralized, leadership discredited, and the alliance broken. But as each detail surfaced, a new kind of resistance grew. Burkina Faso had begun doing what many thought impossible. It turned inward not with fear, but with resolve. Volunteer brigades increased in number. Families who had once remained observers now became active defenders of communities. Intelligence was no longer centralized, it was shared. Markets became hubs of vigilance. Town elders who once told stories began reporting movements of unfamiliar men. A nation had awakened, not from sleep, but from silence. Captain Ibrahim did not flood the airways with speeches. He did not posture. Instead, he met with village heads, with youth leaders, with commanders not behind desks, but in the field. His strength did not radiate from ceremonies or uniforms, but from presence. He was seen. And in a time of manufactured lies, being seen meant everything. It wasn't just an army defending Burkina Faso, it was its memory. A memory of being used, of being dictated to, of being torn apart for resources, for control, for narratives. This time there would be no rewriting, no quiet burial of yet another failed hope. And yet, even in this newfound resistance, the shadow of betrayal still loomed. Because some of those who smiled at Ibrahim shook hands with his enemies behind closed doors. Not every traitor wore different colors. Some wore the same. Some hid not across the border, but in offices just steps away. That was the true genius of the plot. It didn't rely on overwhelming force, but on subtle corrosion. Doubts seeded in whispers, distractions carefully timed, delays masked as technical errors. So when the four mercenaries confessed to their planned surveillance of the presidential convoy, it didn't just confirm the threat, it confirmed the rot. They had been briefed by someone with access to Ibrahim's movements. Internal, trusted. A new phase of the investigation was launched. This time within. Files were rechecked. Staff rotated. Communications filtered through new encryption. And still the question remained: how deep did it go? Then came the final blow. A statement found on a confiscated device from Bisolay to Matu. They'll hold until they lose faith. Break that faith, and the rest falls easily. It wasn't written like a warning. It was a prediction, a strategy. And in those words, the whole operation was revealed for what it was. Not a coup, not even a war. It was a mission to kill belief itself, to crush the will of a people before a single bullet was fired. Because once faith dies, loyalty follows. And once loyalty dies, nations don't need to be conquered. They collapse on their own. But what Bisolay didn't understand, what Matu refused to accept, was that this time, faith wasn't built on speeches or slogans. It was built on scars, on shared suffering, on loss. And scars don't lie. It wasn't just treason anymore. It had become a philosophy, a dark conviction passed between men who believed Africa's independence was too dangerous to be real. They dressed it in the language of stability, of reform, of international cooperation. But at its heart, it was betrayal, repackaged for a modern age. In the days following the arrests, the atmosphere in Ouagadougou shifted, not in panic, but in clarity. People no longer debated whether the threat was real. It was. They no longer wondered if the betrayal was foreign or local. It was both. Now they asked only one question: how do we protect what remains? The intelligence agency released only fragments of what they had uncovered, careful not to incite mass hysteria. But the message was clear. A full-fledged offensive had been prepared. Not only had foreign mercenaries been embedded in neighboring regions, But attempts had also been made to bribe Burkina Faso soldiers and militia leaders into turning their weapons inward. The tactic was old but effective. Don't fight the people, buy them. Offer wealth, rank, escape. Promise promotions, provide new uniforms, new lives. Whisper in their ears that the war was already lost, that resistance was pointless, that Captain Ibrahim would fall, and they could be spared if they turned now. Some listened, a few accepted, but many, quietly, turned those offers over to command. In one particularly chilling case, a commander reported a briefcase left in his tent, filled with cash, a foreign phone, and instructions to vacate his post on a specific night. He didn't touch the money. Instead, he called his superior and stood guard until backup arrived. These moments, small, unseen by the outside world, became the bricks of resistance, not in grand gestures, but in quiet defiance. The kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the kind that endures. Yet the external attacks were far from over. News sources reported cyber operations being activated from servers based in France, Morocco, and Belgium. Attempts to disrupt communications, spread false alerts among military bases, confuse internal coordination systems. The goal was not destruction, but disruption, confusion, paralysis. But they failed to account for the change already taking root inside Burkina Faso's ranks. Loyalty had stopped being a matter of command. It had become a personal decision. Each soldier, each volunteer, each citizen knew the cost of losing this fight, and that knowledge made them immune to doubt. Meanwhile, President Ouattara in Ivory Coast maintained his silence. He didn't deny the allegations. He didn't confirm them. His administration brushed off reports as regional disinformation and accused Burkina Faso of trying to stir panic ahead of Ivorian elections. But silence too speaks, and the silence from those accused became deafening. In the capital of Ivory Coast, streets grew tense. Protesters began appearing with signs not of celebration, but of fear. Fear that their country too had been turned into a pawn in a larger game. Some Ivorians began questioning the official narrative. Why are our taxes funding aircraft if we aren't at war? Why are journalists disappearing? Who is Bassi Matu, and why is his name hidden from every press report? And so, the fracture spread, not just between two countries, but within them. In Burkina Faso, trust tightened. In Ivory Coast, it fractured. Two nations walking the same path in opposite directions, one toward clarity, one into fog. But even as new revelations emerged, emails, bank records, confidential memos, there was an undeniable shift in focus. It was no longer just about exposing betrayal. It was about building something stronger in its place. Captain Ibrahim began visiting regions not to campaign or speak, but to listen, to assess morale, to hear the grievances of civilians who had lived through fear and famine, not theory. He stood without bodyguards in markets where violence had once been common. He shared bread with families who had buried sons. His presence was not symbolic. It was strategic, because he understood something the traitors did not. That war is not only won on battlefields, it is won in the minds of the people who choose whether or not to fight. And those minds, once determined, are harder to defeat than any army. So while jets rusted on distant runways, while bank accounts froze and safe houses were exposed, while foreign voices continued whispering doubt into microphones and boardrooms, Burkina Faso held its breath and stood its ground. Because something unspoken had settled across the land. A line had been drawn. And this time, the people weren't standing behind it. They were standing on it. The silence that had settled over the country was not a sign of fear. It was the silence of readiness. Like the hush before a storm, it spoke louder than any declaration. In every village, in every garrison, in every tired face that had seen too much loss to forget, there was the same look: resolve. By now, the enemy understood brute force would not work. Their first plan, swift decapitation of leadership, had failed. Their second, corruption from within, had crumbled against unexpected integrity. Their third, disinformation, had been met not with confusion, but with vigilance. So they reached for their last weapon: despair. Increased psychological operations were deployed. Radios began broadcasting false reports of internal divisions. Fake announcements declared that high-ranking commanders had defected. Altered footage circulated showing supposed executions. The message behind it all was simple. You are alone. Give up now. But it was already too late, because what they didn't see, what no satellite or intelligence report could measure, was that Burkina Faso had already passed a line no nation can return from. A line where fear becomes familiar, where loss becomes fuel, where betrayal becomes instruction. And once crossed, a people cannot be broken. Not by jets, not by mercenaries, not even by their own doubts. Elders began holding community sessions, not to preach, but to remind, to recount the years when the people had no name, no land, no voice, to speak of the colonial years, when lines were drawn by strangers, of the coups where leaders vanished and hope was forbidden. These weren't just stories, they were warnings. This time would not be like the others. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Ouagadougou, a new office opened. Not a military outpost, not a political wing, but a center for intelligence declassification. Carefully and strategically, the government began to release documents. Not all at once, not recklessly, but piece by piece. Proof of funding trails, proof of coordination meetings, proof of foreign involvement. No longer rumors, no longer theories. Facts. And with facts came unity. Niger, Mali, members of the AES issued their own investigations, quietly sharing information. Safe houses in Bamako and Niamey were raided. Weapons were seized, disguises were discovered. And everywhere the same signature emerged. The same communications patterns, the same names, the same fingerprints. The plot had never been isolated. It had always been regional. But so too was the resistance. The idea that had first united these nations, that they could govern themselves on their own terms, had been dismissed by many as naive. But now, under fire, it was being refined, not as fantasy, but as necessity. This wasn't about ideology, it was about survival. And survival, once internalized by a population, is not something that can be negotiated away. The people of Burkina Faso began fortifying in new ways, not just borders, but trust. Communities created their own surveillance groups. Messages were verified before being believed. In places where electricity was scarce, information moved mouth to mouth. And that information, untainted and unedited, was often more reliable than any headline. The traitors were now fighting on unfamiliar ground. They had come expecting disunity, but they found rhythm. They had prepared to attack a government, but discovered a people. And that people had learned. They had learned that the enemy was not always in uniform, that not every gun carried the same threat as a lie, that not every silence was submission. And most importantly, they had learned to listen to each other, not the voices broadcast from faraway towers. In this new understanding, they became dangerous, because now loyalty had become collective, not something demanded, something chosen. And in the quiet glow of firelit gatherings, in the rhythm of shared meals, in the handshake of neighbors who had once distrusted each other, something invisible began to form. A spine, a national spine, something too strong to bend, too rooted to pull, too familiar with pain to fear it anymore. This was no longer a country waiting to be saved. It was a country refusing to be broken. When those who manipulate the world behind curtains realize their schemes are failing, they often choose one last strategy: distraction. And that's exactly what began to unfold. As evidence of sabotage piled up, in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger aligned more closely than ever before, a strange shift began appearing in international headlines. Reports emerged of terrorism threats, of radical elements, gaining ground in the Sahel. Foreign officials began issuing warnings, some even calling for intervention. The timing wasn't accidental. They wanted to change the story. Suddenly, it wasn't about the plot to assassinate a leader. It wasn't about mercenaries or betrayal. It was about restoring order, protecting civilians, maintaining peace. But everyone in the region knew better. The people had seen this movie before. They remembered how foreign troops once arrived claiming peace and left with pipelines, mineral contracts, and the silence of broken communities. They remembered how international aid often came with conditions that had nothing to do with survival. They remembered how terrorism was often a word used when African nations tried to stand on their own. This time, they weren't falling for it, but that didn't stop the machine. From Paris to Geneva to Washington, officials condemned the growing instability in the region. They framed it as a humanitarian crisis, a security failure, a breakdown of governance. But they avoided the core question. Who funded the planes? Who armed the traitors? Who gave shelter to the architects of betrayal? They spoke loudly, but they said nothing. Meanwhile, back in Ivory Coast, the silence of President Ouattara had begun to fracture. Protests grew larger. His government scrambled to suppress dissent. Civil society groups published open letters demanding accountability. Former allies began speaking cautiously, their language shifting from certainty to concern. The man once considered untouchable was now being questioned in his own streets. And at the center of it all, still untouched, was Bassi Matu. He had vanished from the public eye. Some said he had fled the country, others believed he was in hiding under state protection. But his fingerprints remained everywhere. In the bank transactions, in the encrypted orders, in the safe houses that were raided too late. In truth, he didn't need to speak anymore. His work had already been done, or so he thought. But in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. A former Ivorian intelligence officer, once close to Matu, leaked an internal dossier. It was concise, precise. It outlined the structure of the entire network: names, places, code words, financial paths. The leak spread quietly through encrypted channels, then exploded across independent African media. There were no denials, just silence. And in that silence, a new conversation began across the continent. What does it mean to be sovereign? Is it just a flag, a national anthem, a vote every 5 years? Or is it something deeper? Is it the ability to say no to those who once dictated your borders? Is it the strength to refuse aid when it's poisoned with conditions? Is it the courage to punish your own if they betray the people? In that moment, many Africans began asking not what Burkina Faso was doing wrong, but what it was doing right. How had it managed to resist so much with so little? How had it survived betrayal without collapsing? And the answer was unsettling to many in power. It had done so through loyalty, through unity not enforced by fear but forged in fire, through a leader who did not hide, through people who did not break, through memories that refused to fade. Captain Ibrahim had not delivered perfection. There were still challenges, still wounds, but he had delivered something far rarer: trust. And trust once earned in blood cannot be bought with gold. So even as foreign agencies drafted new strategies, even as media campaigns intensified, even as think tanks issued reports warning of authoritarian drift, the people of Burkina Faso kept moving forward, not blindly, but boldly. They repaired roads not because they were told to, but because they needed them. They guarded borders not because they were paid, but because they were home. They buried their dead with honor, not with bitterness. They remembered their martyrs, not with grief, but with pride. And so the war, designed to fracture, had instead created something no weapon could destroy: conviction. A quiet, steady conviction that even if the skies darkened again, even if betrayals returned, even if the world chose not to understand, they would stand. Not because they were commanded, but because they had finally remembered who they were. In the end, it was never just about Captain Ibrahim. It was about the soul of a continent, about whether history would repeat itself or finally, painfully, begin to bend in a different direction. What happened in Burkina Faso wasn't just a failed coup or an exposed conspiracy. It was a mirror, a reflection of everything Africa had endured and everything it could become. A continent that had once been sliced apart by outsiders now stood at a crossroads, this time with the blade held from within. And that was always the most dangerous threat. Not the foreign drone or the foreign diplomat, but the local voice willing to sell its silence. The man who speaks your language, but not your truth. The neighbor who opens the door, not for peace, but for profit. In that mirror, Africans across the region began to see more than conflict. They saw themselves. They saw the dangers of forgetting, the cost of trusting too easily, the risk of letting others define what leadership should look like. But they also saw something else, something they hadn't seen in a long time. They saw a country that didn't fold, a people that didn't kneel, a president who didn't vanish. For decades, African nations were told to obey, to follow models that were never built for them, to measure their worth in the approval of powers they could never compete with. But in Burkina Faso, something different happened. They stopped asking for permission, and they started asking better questions. Who benefits from our fear? Who writes our stories? Who profits from our pain? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. And in those answers, the betrayal lost its grip. Because betrayal only works when people stop asking. But Burkina Faso didn't stop. Not when bombs were threatened, not when lies were broadcast, not when foreign agents walked their soil, not even when some of their own turned against them. They kept asking, kept resisting, kept building. And in doing so, they reminded an entire continent of something long buried under treaties, puppet governments, and broken promises. That Africa does not need to be saved. It needs to be left to rise. And that rising is not loud. It's not always televised. It does not always come with applause. Sometimes it is quiet, slow, fragile, but it is real. Burkina Faso's rise was not marked by global headlines or international medals. It was marked by the silence of defeated conspirators, the panic in foreign ministries, the discomfort of those who realized their usual tactics had failed. Because this time they underestimated what loyalty looks like when it's born from suffering. What leadership means when it's lived, not just spoken. What unity can achieve when it's held not by policy, but by pain and shared purpose. And so, as the mercenaries scattered, as the propaganda machine stuttered, as the shadows retreated, the country did not celebrate in song or spectacle. They simply returned to work, to rebuild what had been threatened, to restore what had been defamed, to protect what had nearly been lost. Because the greatest victory is not survival, it is memory. The memory of those who refused to run, the memory of those who stayed loyal when silence would have been safer, the memory of those who fought not for glory, but for dignity. And in that memory, Africa found something it had been searching for across generations. Not a hero, not a party, not a savior, but a standard, a measure by which all future leaders would now be judged. Do they stand when it's hardest? Do they lead when it's quiet? Do they bleed before they betray? And above all, do they earn trust not with words, but with sacrifice? Burkina Faso had answered those questions. And no matter how loud the lies grow, no matter how persistent the betrayals may become, the truth remains, etched not on paper, but in the hearts of those who stood firm. Africa is no longer asking for freedom, it is remembering it. And in that remembrance, something irreversible has begun.